The German government itself recovering, remember this was only 4 years after the end of the war, refugees everywhere. These Russian Mennonites were coming across from the east and ensconcing themselves in any available farmyard and nook and cranny and barns and chicken house. I mean, it's a very, very tragic story. The big issue was, where are we going to settle these people? Where are they going to go? When I came there, saw the crowded one big gymnasium, huge gymnasium, which had wires strung across the big hall, crosswise, one direction and crosswise, and they had cubicles 12 feet by 12 feet, blankets hung, and in these families lived for months. So there were tremendous concentrations of refugees.
To address the housing crisis, the relief agency Mennonite Central Committee, or MCC as it was known, asked the German government for assistance in finding a place to settle refugees. The German government agreed to provide land where houses for refugees could be built. 80% of the construction costs would come from German funds that had been frozen by the Allies. MCC offered to fund 10%. Upon completion of the house, this amount would be converted to a 30-year mortgage and repaid. That left the destitute refugees needing to come up with a 10% down payment before construction could begin. Finally, the government agreed that the labor of volunteers helping build the houses would cover the refugees' down payment.
And that's where we got the idea of establishing a PAX program where we would have young people from America coming to Europe to do their alternative service.
With this agreement in place, the housing program moved forward.
This was at the beginning of the Korean War. And so the draft was initiated again. And so we proposed to the MCC that these people would come to Europe and give 2 years of their lives and that they would provide for their own expenses.
It would cost each volunteer $75 per month. The call went out for young men to come to Europe to build houses.
When the announcement came out, MCC was inundated by volunteers. Within 3 months, they had a unit sailing for Europe.
I had a strong sense that it was important for non-resistant followers of Jesus to do a kind of equivalent service to what was being asked of people who went into the military.
The first PAX fellows arrived in Germany in the spring of 1951. They began work in the village of Espelkamp. They would soon open units in several other locations. The task facing the PAX boys was to turn rural and forested land into a modern urban development. Refugees who had lived for years in barracks and camps would be moving into trim suburban houses built by PAX volunteers.
When the first PAX unit came, we had to literally convince the Bauleiter, the person who was in charge of the construction, that these young farm boys could actually be trusted with a trowel and start laying blocks.
Our American assumption was that an American could do anything and do it faster and better than the Germans could. And so we were never intimidated, and we actually did substantial work.
The bureaucratic obstacles multiplied.
every tree in Germany is numbered, so you can't cut a tree down without getting permission to cut it down. It had all been arranged that the guys would arrive there on the 6th of January, and by the 12th we would be ready to work. By that time, then, the permission would have had to be granted to clear the trees where these houses were to be built. Every day I'd call Rolando, that was the closest town, and says, well, have the trees been approved for destruction? No, nothing happened yet. So the day I said, okay, guys, we've got to start working, the permission still hadn't been granted to cut the trees down to dig the foundation. I told the guys, okay, let's get the Dodge Power Wagon, let's pull these trees down, we're going to get to work. And when the first tree was coming down, I called the Rodden office and said, the guys are pulling the trees down. He was out there within a half an hour and was mad as a hornet. And he just flailing his arms up and down. He says, this is breaking the law. You guys are, I said, you agreed to have this already. And it didn't take more than a day, and permission was granted, and they came out there and cut these trees down.
When the Pax boys arrived, they discovered that they would be building hundreds of houses and doing it almost entirely without mechanized tools.
Boy, my first job was digging these septic tanks down through the sandstone. And I mean, that was a job. Boy, they put all the new guys to that.
It was back-breaking work, and they wanted to see of what kind of fiber you were made of. So that was the initiation.
I thought I was tough. I mean, I was a farm kid. But I mean, I got blisters in my hands.
We lived in the first several houses that we built. Each house had 4 apartments in it.
All the foundations, floors, and mortar for blocks required concrete that would be mixed on site.
It was overwhelmingly exhausting and tiring, and I totally wore myself out.
But even before the cement could be mixed, the Paxers needed to dig out the aggregate for the concrete from an underground vein of lava ash.
I wasn't prepared. I got lonely as all get out, and I wrote letters on the weekends to my friends in college that I never mailed. I couldn't admit to them that I was that lonely.
All the concrete blocks for house construction were handmade, 2 at a time, using the same lava ash. Each finished block was stacked to dry in the sun. Then each block was loaded and transported to one of several building sites. There they were unloaded and again neatly stacked.
All of the refugees for whom we were building houses, most of them came out of the camp Oksbøl in Denmark. And all of them were refugees out of West Prussia who had been interred in that camp behind barbed wire.
While in Germany, waiting for their homes to be completed, they remained destitute refugees. Meanwhile, construction continued on what would become an entirely new community inhabited by former refugees.
The event of the week was everybody went down to the city bath. We didn't have a shower where we were living. There was no way to take a bath. So every Friday night, it was reserved for us for 1 hour. Often we would stand in the shower and sing. They wondered what was going on in there, but crazy Americans, you know.
Our work hours were basically 9 hours a day, rain or shine.
I remember the digging, then learning to lay bricks and blocks.
Although the PAX volunteers worked with little supervision at the worksite, the director of the program was highly regarded.
All in all, there were about 100 PAX guys in Germany, scattered throughout 5 or 6 units, and he had to weld them into one. He had to keep them on purpose. He had to motivate them so they'd get up in the morning and go to work and come home in the evening and so on and so on.
The houses look much more elegant than the way we left them.
We are always thankful to the PAX boys that they gave us a new home.
In nearby Austria, the Church of the Brethren had taken on a massive rebuilding project. The only Protestant school in Austria had been gutted when Hitler's retreating army set fire to it.
The inside shell burned out, but it didn't destroy the superstructure.
The PAX boys joined Brethren service volunteers to rebuild what came to be called the Karlschule.
It was one big school. Austria and Vienna is almost all Catholic. The only Protestant school was this one. It was in the middle of Vienna. A historic building is a monument, and they have to put it exactly back the way it was.
I remember the first job they gave me there. I was to work up on the top scaffolding up underneath the eaves of the building. The first day or two, I didn't do too much work up there. I was too busy hanging on to the planks to keep from falling off. We sat up there on that scaffolding with little wire brushes or a part of a pair of scissors or something to scrape the soot and the dirt off the frieze work that was left up there.
We had to remove the old mortar from between the bricks and replace it with new mortar.
And then to make it look old, we had to go back over all those joints with graphite pencils to meet the requirements of the city for historical buildings or whatever.
"50 years later, a group of PAXmen returned to Vienna to see what had become of the Karlschule and to speak with the students.
On behalf of the two schools that are here, the elementary school and the middle school, I would like to welcome you.
Coming back to the Karlschule was a fulfillment of a dream that we only seen part of. Now we could see it in its completion where it was in operation.
In April 1952, the first PAX volunteers left Germany for Greece.
Greece, especially northern Greece, Macedonia, they were just on their knees. They were totally poor, poverty-stricken.
Vivi Maridas was a child when the PAX boys arrived. Her father worked as their translator.
Had just come out of the Civil War, and it was a very poor, underdeveloped country. Especially the area of Panagitsa had suffered a lot of the Civil War. That was between the nationalists and the communists. The villages were burned, and there was hunger, actual hunger, among the villagers.
Και αυτό μας έκανε να έχουμε όλο τον χρόνο τρόφιμα και σε εκείνα τα πολύ δύσκολα χρόνια που ύστερα από 10 χρόνια πόλεμο δεν είχαμε να φάμε κυριολεκτικά.
The village of Panagitsa had remained loyal to the Greek government during the Civil War. The Greek government and the Greek Orthodox Church decided to reward the loyal village with young American pacifists to help rebuild their war-ravaged community.
I went to Greece and I did not know one word in Greek. And I didn't know much about Greece.
The volunteers were told they would be rebuilding war-torn housing similar to what they had been doing in Germany. But it soon became clear that the Greeks had more pressing priorities.
Το χειμώνα ήταν όλα τα χωράφια στο νερό μέσα και το καλοκαίρι ξεραινότανε και δεν είχαμε δρόμο να τα ποτίσουμε. Βρήκαν ένα λαό που ήταν τσακισμένος από το Δεύτερο Παγκόσμιο Πόλεμο, από τον εμφύλιο πόλεμο.
Basically, they had a few cows to do their plowing.
When we were there, nobody had electricity and nobody had a car. There was one bicycle, but that was the village.
It was a fruit-producing area, wonderful peaches. When we got there, they were feeding these beautiful peaches and pears and plums and apricots to the hogs because they had absolutely no way of preserving them.
To address seasonal food shortages, the Pax Boys built an experimental farm. Here, farmers would come to learn about higher-yielding crops and better breeds of animals.
We introduced hybrid seed corn and fertilizer. If they used hybrid corn, the ears were twice as big, and I mean, they got corn and the corn fodder they could also use, and that got much bigger.
As they had fled to the cities for protection during the Civil War, their fields grew up into heavy sod, little trees, and so they couldn't possibly break this soil with their wooden plows and cows and horses. And so that's when MCC brought in a tractor to our village and to another village with a plow and a disc. And we ran that tractor day and night, plowing and breaking the soil so they could farm it.
Και ξεκίνησα με την ομάδα του Mennonite να κάνουμε δουλειά. Η δουλειά ήταν ότι θέλαν αυτοί έναν οδηγό για να οργώνει με το τρακτέρ. Επειδή τα χωράφια όταν ήρθαν αυτοί ήταν ακαλλιέργητα και όταν τελειώσανε και μείνανε λίγα χωράφια, τότε δεν θέλαν πια να δουλέψουν.
Να καταλάβουμε πώς ήμασταν τότε. Κάποτε το τρακτέρ που είχαν εδώ τα παιδιά χάλασε και το κόψαν στα δύο προκειμένου να το διορθώσουν. Και ο κόσμος, πολλοί άνθρωποι από γύρω έλεγαν αυτό πια, το παρομοίαζαν με ένα βόδι που το κόψαν στη μέση και δεν μπορεί πια να ζήσει. Και αυτό λένε τελείωσε πια, πέσανε. It's dead. This tractor is not working, no more. Και όταν το είδα πάλι να δουλεύει ήταν σαν να αναστήθηκε ένας άνθρωπος. Κάναν το σταυρό τους που λέμε εδώ στην Ελλάδα.
To make the abundance of summer fruits and vegetables last through the winter, the young men taught villagers how to preserve food by canning. At first, glass jars were used, but most families could not afford them.
I did some research and found out there were tin cans made in the local city, which I could buy for a penny and a half a piece. And after a lot of discussion with MCC and with the village, MCC agreed to provide $500 used for a sealer, for pots and pans and boilers. Oh, we did run the water from the spring into the butcher shop so that we did have running water in there, one spigot, and I think it was the only building in town where we had indoor running water. They had started to build this building as a coffee house and then changed it in midstream to become the cannery. The first year we filled 10,000 cans. This was for home use only, just for 125 families in the village. The next year we filled 25,000 cans.
Και ήταν ο Χάντς, ο μαέστρος. Ο μαέστρος ήταν αυτός εδώ. Και τελευταία το αφήσανε στην κοινότητα, το οποίο το διαχειρίστηκα εγώ 2 χρόνια. Έφτασε αυτό εδώ το μικρό κονσερβό. Περάσανε 50 χρόνια και νομίζω ότι είναι τώρα.
Over time, the experimental farm continued to grow. To improve egg production, stock was imported for crossbreeding with local chickens. The Paxmen set up a hatchery capable of hatching 2,000 eggs at a time. These chicks were in high demand in Greek farmyards as families realized the benefits of raising larger, meatier chickens that also produced more eggs. Perhaps the most ambitious program the Pax Boys tried was the importation of high milk-producing breeds of cattle to cross with local stock. Working with Church of the Brethren's Heifer Project International, purebred cows were donated by the people of the United States. One packsman built a hand-operated baler so that hay bales could be stored for winter feeding. Another designed a hand-operated feed mixer from local materials. Reflecting on their experiences, some packsmen questioned whether they left anything of lasting value in the communities they served.
I had good intentions, but I actually didn't have all that much to offer.
The PAX boys were of tremendous assistance to the Greeks at that time.
We did a few things. We built friendships. We built tremendous friendships.
50 years after the first PAX boys arrived in Greece, a group returned to the villages in which they had worked as an alternative to military service. The experimental farm, turned over to the Ministry of Agriculture when they left, was still there.
At the front here we had a small office where we kept our records and bookwork. Next then we had the hatchery where this door is. We had the incubators in here and did our egg hatching in here.
When the PAX program closed, a local farmer bought the hatchery. Today, there are many hatcheries in the area. One specializes in fertile eggs for breeding stock. Although the community canneries are no longer necessary, the skills learned from the PAX years led to the development of small commercial canneries in the area. Arlen had a chance to meet the young owner of one of these canneries.
He knew the PAX boys and he learned. Okay. From here he learned and then he moved on from there and learned. The trip to Greece was worth this moment.
Αυτοί με αυτά που μας δείξανε και είδαμε ας πούμε και μας βοηθήσανε πάρα πολύ, μάθαμε και εμείς και ύστερα αρχίσαμε μόνοι μας να δουλεύουμε.
It was the first time that we saw people of another religion. Even if it was very, very different, it affected my family because we were impressed by the way they lived. We saw good, gentle, helping people, and that's all you need.
By the time the program ended in 1965, more than 130 young men had given at least 2 years of their lives to help the people of Greece get back on their economic feet.
I think all of us would say it did more for us than it did for them.
In 1956, the PAX program expanded into Paraguay, where a road connecting isolated settlements in the Chaco with the capital city of Asuncion was being built. By 1950, thousands of German immigrants had settled the Paraguayan Chaco, an inhospitable land often called the Green Hell. Some had fled Canada when provincial education requirements came in conflict with their desire to retain their German identity. More came as refugees from the world wars.
Paraguay always had a lack of people, and most immigrants from Europe and other parts, they came to Argentina and to Brazil, and only the poorest, they came to Paraguay.
Native people used the area as hunting lands. A few cattle ranchers who saw potential on the wide open spaces for cattle grazing had built permanent homes. Here, in the blistering heat of the Green Hell, Mennonite immigrants were trying to establish farms. It was a struggle just to stay alive. Successful farming depends on access to markets. In the Chaco, there were no markets. The only place in the country where their products could be sold was the capital city of Asuncion.
But that was 250 miles away from Asuncion, and there was no road. The only way to go was a little bit by rail, by wagon and horses, and then by boat.
A trip so long, fat cattle leaving the Chaco arrived in Asuncion thin. In a visit to the Mennonite settlements in 1954, President Alfredo Stroessner assured that a road from Asuncion would be built.
The Trans-Chaco Road was built. It was a coalition of the American government, the Paraguayan government, the Mennonites, basically MCC with the Mennonites in the Chaco, and the ranchers. Initiative came from the Mennonites.
According to the agreement, young Mennonite fellows from the United States and Canada would operate road-building equipment. As conscientious objectors, the young men would do this work in place of military service.
I believe it's wrong for a Christian to go to war and to take up arms, and I wanted to go as a conscious objector.
By this time, the success of the European PAX program was well known by draft-age conscientious objectors. Laverne decided to apply to do his alternative service with PAX.
A call from MCC says, "Would you want to go to Paraguay?" Where's Paraguay? And I says, and then they said, "You got about 2 weeks' time to decide." And within, I think, a month's time, we were gone. MCC told us what to bring. They told us what kind of clothes we should probably bring, and they said, you know, there might be pretty good hunting over there. And so they said, bring a rifle along. So all of us had a rifle, and would you believe it? We carried our rifles onto the Braniff plane, put them on the overhead rack, and we flew that way to Paraguay.
Mennonite Central Committee urged the United States government to make available surplus road-building equipment from the Korean War.
This equipment came in batches of like 6 to 8 scrapers at a time.
They were brought over, landed in Asunción, and then with some good mechanical attention, they were started up, and we PAX guys, that was my first assignment, to get up on one of these, learn how to drive that monster, and then drive it down the road, which is far too narrow for a monster. All the donkeys and cars and carretas had to move to the side make room for our equipment. Took it to the place opposite the town of WWII.
Since there were no bridges, the only way to cross the river was by barge.
So we loaded it onto the barge. I thought we would sink out of sight on that little barge. Took it across, and that's where they stayed. So instead of contributing to destruction somewhere in Asia, they were here used to build a road, a very much needed route to the interior of Paraguay.
Harry Harder, a farmer and mechanic from Mountain Lake, Minnesota, would supervise the project. His son Martin was a teenager at the time.
Our entire family went to Paraguay in June of 1956. I was age 13 at the time. About 3 months of the year, I went to spend time working on correspondence course. The rest of the time I spent on the road with the PAX men and my father.
Road building began on the outskirts of Asunción. While the heart of the Chaco was usually dry, the area leading out of Asunción was tropical with frequent rains often idling heavy equipment.
Very little was known about what we were going to be running into. We knew there'd be swamps, but people could not tell us how deep they were going to be. The topsoil is such a high percentage of sand, it does not provide a good roadbed. So we had to use the borrow pit method to dig clay out of these big pits to use for constructing the road, because the clay provides a very good road surface.
I was what they called a field foreman, that once the surveyors went through and set the stakes, it was my responsibility when the dirt came with the scrapers to make it up to grade and everything. We got to know the people we worked with quite well on the road project.
We slept, ate, drank tereré with the guys. We were close to them. We knew their language. Not only did that open our mind to one another, but also to the Paraguayan culture, to their way of thinking, which was very different. The idea was we drove the turnipoles, and on each turnipole there was a soldier boy who was learning to operate the equipment.
These fellows have never driven anything larger than an ox cart before, so it is really hard for them to catch on. Their mistakes are so costly on this big machinery. At the present, there are 3 Heil transmissions out. It may be months till parts get here. Letter home, 1957.
The PAX boys looked forward to weekends in Asunción.
we worked in dust and in the heat and out in the open all day. And we'd come back in and there was no air conditioning.
We finally built our own living quarters that were movable. We had to put screens on them so we didn't have to use mosquito nets.
Our shack is just made of rough lumber with big cracks in the floor and sides. All it does is break a little of the wind, but it's just as cold inside as outside. It's just like a corn crib at home. Letter home, 1958.
You had to learn to like rice and beans and rice, probably 3 times a day, soup.
You get used to a lot of things here. The bugs are always bad in the evening when you eat. Your food is just covered with them. Sometimes you fish out the big ones, but it's no use to bother. We're in Paraguay. Letter home, 1957.
The biggest problem was that we didn't have good water to drink. We actually drank water out of the river where we'd swim, where the alligators were, and so forth.
It was rough going, it was primitive, it was raw.
It would have been sissy of us to complain. You proved yourself to your fellow guys that you're a man.
Sometimes the Pax Fellows' drive to get the road finished came in conflict with Paraguay's cultural planners.
On the 15th of August, President Stroessner will be re-inaugurated, and there is to be a huge parade again like last year of Trans Chaco machines. At first they wanted 6 scrapers, 3 tractors, the crane, the lowboy, and a tanker. The whole thing is still stupid. At best, there will be over 2 weeks lost in bringing everything into town and back out again, so work will almost have to come to a standstill. Letter home, 1958.
We had a lot of fun. We went on vacations together. We played a lot of rook. Went to movies sometimes and went to the local swimming pool when we were in Asuncion and that sort of thing. And we just had a ball together.
By 1961, the road from Asuncion to the Chaco was complete. Agricultural products were moving from the Chaco to the capital city. The lives of the desperate immigrants began to change.
It changed completely all our life in the colony.
Right, there was this interchanging of products and also people, and it changed the thinking of the people. People were not by themselves anymore after the road opened.
It's a tremendous effect because you can go by bus to Asuncion. Young people go there.
Before the road was built, people tried to survive. Now they can already project themselves for the future.
It took another 30 years for Paraguay to cover the road with asphalt paving.
Traveling the first years, that take us sometimes 10 days to come to Asuncion.
Now we figure 4 hours.
Without this road, it had been impossible to make this development as they did.
Today, the road stands as a testament to the foresight of those involved in its planning and the tenacity of the Pax boys who gave 2 years of their lives to its construction. The Chaco, the green hell where it was thought no one could survive, is today the breadbasket of Paraguay.
1/3, a little bit more than 1/3 of the whole cattle production comes from the Chaco.
More than 50% of all dairy products come from the Chaco, yeah?
So it is the biggest milk provider for the nation. The income per capita is about $12,000 per year, while in the rest of in the remaining country, the average is about $1,140.
Often I heard the comment, if it hadn't been for the Paxmen, the road wouldn't have been built. That's an overstatement. It probably wouldn't have been built at that time. But we were the only ones at that point in time who were willing to go out there in those conditions and simply grind it out and do it.
The Trans-Chaco Road was one of those few projects where you might say that the people really had the impression that it was their project.
In 1955, PACs began work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was very different from the work they had done in Europe. Here they assisted in food and clothing distribution, refugee resettlement, maintenance, construction, and agricultural development projects. Fremont Regier and his friend and fellow volunteer Larry Kaufman were the first PACs men in the Congo.
We went out on Belgian freighter. It took 21 days from New York to Matadi. And then we drove inland. A missionary came to meet us.
Rather than massive building projects manned by large units of PACs volunteers, in the Congo, individual PACs men usually lived and worked in isolated village settings. While their task was to better the lives of the Congolese, there were few successful models to follow, so they experimented, trying a series of development projects until they found something that was culturally appropriate. Fremont was immediately placed in charge of 70 local workers.
I supervised these men on a large construction project and furniture building and some houses. The immediate need we saw was lack of protein. And so we started looking at livestock projects. First we thought chickens. But then we came to realize that chickens compete with people for food. Chickens eat very much the same stuff people do. But rabbits, we call that the poor man's chicken, ate what you could find in the forest, palm leaves, palm branches, certain greens, and so we started promoting rabbits. We started extension routes where we go out on a bicycle.
1 week out of the month, we would go out into the villages on our extension routes and eat, sleep with them. During the duration of those 4, 5, 6 days, we would cover about 120 miles on bicycle, just me and a Congolese counterpart.
We'd ride to a village and stop and talk.
Kind of explain to them the connection of health to protein intake.
And it's deep sand, a lot of time you're pushing.
We would encourage them in the raising of small animal projects. The biggest thing we pushed was rabbits.
Is anybody interested in raising rabbits? If there were, we told them get this kind of bamboo materials and things on hand, some posts and stuff. Next month when we come, we'll help you build your hutch. Then you can come to us and buy a bread dough and we'll give you some tin cans and you're in business. You get a bread dough and in a couple of weeks she kindles, and you might have 6 or 8 young. Half of those are does. You save those 6 months and breed them. By the end of the year, you got rabbits out your ears.
The only thing we took with us was our bedrolls. Staying out for these 3, 4, 5, 6 days at a time, we ate what they ate and slept where they slept. I recall not liking to go out during caterpillar season. We ate lizard, hippo, grubs. I enjoyed eels. Eels were really good. It was always a struggle for me to pull into a village and hear the squawking of a chicken. I mean, I would much rather eat greens or even caterpillars than have them kill a chicken for me.
We had around 500 rabbit producers we were visiting every month.
We were quite isolated. Often it was 5 weeks between mail. Evenings were long. It was already dark at 6, so we spent a lot of time journaling, writing letters, going to the village, spending time with people.
At one center where we had 2 PACs men and a Congolese extension agent, it was in a forested area where the people had wild game and fish. And they really weren't interested in rabbits. But these poor PACs guys, that was their assignments, where every month they'd ride out there and try to tell people to raise rabbits. And at the far end of one of these routes was Lake Matamapi. And one of the caretakers there had a beautiful rabbit project. Had it up off the ground, fence around so dogs wouldn't get it and all of that. So we were there vacationing once, and I asked you, Jules, why do you raise rabbits? Your wife catches fish in the lake here. You have snares and traps, and you hunt in the forest. You have wild game. Why are you raising rabbits? He said to have something to kill to feed the PACsmen when they come to tell me to raise rabbits.
By this time, I was pretty realistic already, realizing that I would leave Africa more or less like I had found it. I wasn't going to significantly change Africa, but that Africa would significantly change me.
They related to the villagers. First of all, they were out there a lot on their bikes, spending nights in the village. They'd be gone for a week, each night in a different village. They learned the language because of that.
We didn't want to carry the hat of missionary. And yet, as far as the Congolese concerned, they never saw the difference. They saw us as being higher energy. We related much differently. We were missionaries as far as they were concerned.
The PAX program continued to expand around the world. Eventually, the need for unskilled development workers overseas waned. In 1973, military conscription ceased. By the time the program ended in 1975, nearly 1,200 young men had served 2 years of their lives in overseas assignments in 40 countries as an alternative to the destruction of war.
I think it's part of our mandate, not just giving of ourselves, but also receiving. I think both are part of service, that as you give, you also receive.
Well, Bob always felt that PAX was the most important change in his life. He went from being a secluded farm boy to out in the world.
It was such a foundational experience that just about the rest of my life has been built on that foundation.
It has exploded the worldview.
The world just became much more complicated, and the answers weren't as simple as what I would have hoped that they would be.
Serving other people is at the core of, I think, Jesus' ministry.